everyone, welcome back to Mrs Cook's Story Time. We had a little break for Easter in which we ate far too much chocolate, and now we're back with our story of Bod in The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. We're on the 8th section now, so let's try and remind ourselves what's happened to Bod. He's just met the witch at the bottom of the graveyard, hasn't he? So let's carry on and see what he gets up to. It was 9 in the morning, when all the world is sleeping. Bod was determined to stay awake. He was, after all, on a mission. He was 8 years old, and the world beyond the graveyard held no terrors for him. Clothes. He would need clothes. His usual dress of a grey winding sheet was, he knew, quite wrong. It was good in the graveyard, the same colour as stone and as shadows, but if he was going to dare the world beyond the graveyard walls, he would need to blend in there. There were some clothes in the crypt beneath the ruined chapel, but Bod did not want to go down to the crypt, not even in daylight. While Bod was prepared to justify himself to Master and Mistress Owens, he was not about to explain himself to Silas. The very thought of those dark, angry eyes, or worse still, disappointed, filled him with shame. There was a gardener's hut at the far end of the graveyard, a small green building that smelled like motor oil, and in which the old mower sat and rusted, unused, along with an assortment of ancient garden tools. The hut had been abandoned when the last gardener had retired, before Bod was born, and the task of keeping the graveyard had been shared between the council, who sent a man to cut the grass and clean the paths once a month from April to September, and the local volunteers in the Friends of the Graveyard. A huge padlock on the door protected the contents of the hut, but Bod had long ago discovered the loose wooden board in the back. Sometimes he would go to the gardener's hut and sit and think when he wanted to be by himself. As long as he had been going to the hut, there had been a brown working man's jacket hanging on the back of the door, forgotten or abandoned years before, along with a green-stained pair of gardening jeans. The jeans were much too big for him, but he rolled up the bottoms until his feet showed. Then he made a belt out of brown garden twine and tied it around his waist. There were boots in one corner, and he tried putting them on, but they were so big and encrusted with mud and concrete that he could barely shuffle in them, and if he took a step, the boots remained on the floor of the shed. He pushed the jacket right out through the space in the loose board, squeezed himself out, then put it on. If he rolled up the sleeves, he decided, it worked quite well. It had big pockets, and he thrust his hands into them and felt quite the dandy. Bod walked down to the main gate of the graveyard and looked out through the bars. A bus rattled past in the street. There were cars there and noise and shops. Behind him, a cool green shade, overgrown with trees and ivy. Home. His heart pounding, Bod walked out into the world. Ebenezer Bolger had seen some odd types in his time. If you owned a shop like Ebenezer's, you'd see them too. The shop, in the warren of streets in the old town, a little bit antique shop, a little bit junk shop, a little bit pawnbrokers, and not even Ebenezer himself was entirely certain which was which, brought odd types and strange people, some of them wanting to buy, some of them needing to sell. Ebenezer Bolger traded over the counter, buying and selling, and he did a better trade behind the counter and in the back room, accepting objects that may not have been acquired entirely honestly, and then quietly shifting them on. His business was an iceberg. Only the dusty little shop was visible on the surface. The rest of it was underneath, and that was just how Ebenezer Bolger wanted it. Ebenezer Bolger had thick spectacles and a permanent expression of mild distaste, as if he'd just realised that the milk in his tea had been on the turn and he could not get the sour taste of it out of his mouth. The expression served him well when people tried to sell him things. "Honestly," he would tell them, sour-faced, "it's not really worth anything at all. I'll give you what I can, though, as it has sentimental value." You were lucky to get anything like what you thought you wanted from Ebenezer Bolger. A business like Ebenezer Bolger's brought in strange people, but the boy who came in that morning was one of the strangest Ebenezer could remember in a lifetime of cheating strange people out of their valuables. He looked about 7 years old and dressed in his grandfather's clothes. He smelled like a shed. His hair was long and shaggy, and he seemed extremely grave. His hands were deep in the pockets of a dusty brown jacket, but even with the hands out of sight, Ebenezer could see that something was clutched extremely tightly, protectively, in the boy's right hand. "Excuse me," said the boy. "Aye, aye, Sonny Jim," said Ebenezer Bolger warily. Kids, he thought. Either they've nicked something or they're trying to sell their toys. Either way, he usually said no. Buy stolen property from a kid and the next thing you knew you'd an enraged adult accusing you of having given little Johnny or Matilda a tenner for their wedding ring. More trouble than they were worth, kids. "I need something for a friend of mine," said the boy. "And I thought maybe you could buy something I've got." "I don't buy stuff from kids," said Ebenezer Bolger flatly. Bod took his hand out of his pocket and put the brooch down on the grimy countertop. Bolger glanced down at it. Then he looked at it. He removed his spectacles, took an eyepiece from the countertop and screwed it into his eye. He turned on a little light on the counter and examined the brooch through the eyeglass. "Snakestone?" he said to himself, not to the boy. Then he took the eyepiece out, replaced his glasses and fixed the boy with a sour and suspicious look. "Where did you get this?" Ebenezer Bolger asked. Bod said, "Do you want to buy it?" "You stole it. You've nicked this from a museum or somewhere, didn't you?" "No," said Bod flatly. "Are you going to buy it? Or shall I go and find somebody who will?" Ebenezer Bolger's sour mood changed then. Suddenly he was all affability. He smiled broadly. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's just you don't see many pieces like this, not in a shop like this, not outside a museum, but I would certainly like it. Tell you what, why don't we sit down over tea and biscuits? I've got a packet of chocolate chip cookies in the back room and decide how much something like this is worth, eh?" Bod was relieved that the man was finally being friendly. "I need enough to buy a stone," he said. "A headstone for a friend of mine. Well, she's not really my friend, just someone I know. I think she helped make my leg better, you see." Ebenezer Bolger paid little attention to the boy's prattle, led him behind the counter and opened the door to the storeroom, a windowless little space, every inch of which was crammed high with teetering cardboard boxes, each filled with junk. There was a safe in there, in the corner, a big, old one. There was a box filled with violins, an accumulation of stuffed dead animals, chairs without seats, books and prints. There was a small desk beside the door, and Ebenezer Bolger pulled up the only chair and sat down, letting Bod stand. Ebenezer rummaged in a drawer in which Bod could see a half-empty bottle of whisky and pulled out an almost finished packet of chocolate chip cookies, and he offered one to the boy. turned on the desk light, looked at the brooch again, the swirls of red and orange in the stone, and he examined the black metal band that encircled it, suppressing a little shiver at the expression on the heads of the snake things. "This is old," he said. "It's priceless," he thought. "Probably not really worth much, but you never know." Bod's face fell. Abanazar Bolger tried to look reassuring. "I just need to know that it's not stolen, though, before I can give you a penny. Did you take it from your mum's dresser? Nick it from a museum? You can tell me. I'll not get you into trouble. I just need to know." Bod shook his head. He munched on his cookie. "Then where did you get it?" Bod said nothing. Abanazar Bolger did not want to put down the brooch, but he pushed it across the desk to the boy. "If you can't tell me," he said, "you'd better take it back. There has to be trust on both sides, after all. Nice doing business with you. Sorry it couldn't go any further." Bod looked worried. Then he said, "I found it in an old grave, but I can't say where." He stopped, because naked greed and excitement had replaced the friendliness on Abanazar Bolger's face. "And there's more like this there?" Bod said, "If you don't want to buy it, I'll find someone else. Thank you for the biscuit." Bolger said, "You're in a hurry, eh? Mum and Dad waiting for you, I expect." The boy shook his head, then wished he'd nodded. "Nobody waiting. Good." Abanazar Bolger closed his hands around the brooch. "Now, you tell me exactly where you found this, eh?" "I don't remember," said Bod. "Too late for that," said Abanazar Bolger. "Suppose you have a little think for a bit about where it came from. Then, when you've thought, we'll have a little chat, and you'll tell me." He got up and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. He locked it with a large metal key. He opened his hand and looked at the brooch and smiled hungrily. There was a ding from the bell above the shop door to let him know someone had entered, and he looked up guiltily, but there was no one there. The door was slightly ajar, though, and Bolger pushed it shut. Then, for good measure, he turned around the sign in the window so it said closed. He pushed the bolt shut. Didn't want any busybodies turning up today. The autumn day had turned from sunny to grey, and a light patter of rain ran down the grubby shop window. Abanazar Bolger picked up the telephone from the counter and pushed at the buttons with fingers that barely shook. "Pay dirt, Tom," he said. "Get over here as soon as you can." Bod realised that he was trapped when he heard the lock turn in the door. He pulled on the door, but it held fast. He felt stupid for having been lured inside, foolish for not trusting his first impulses to get as far away from the sow-faced man as possible. He'd broken all the rules of the graveyard, and everything had gone wrong. What would Silas say? Or the Owenses? He could feel himself beginning to panic, and he suppressed it, pushing the worry back down inside him. It would all be good, he knew that. Of course, he needed to get out. He examined the room he was trapped in. It was little more than a storeroom with a desk in it. The only entrance was the door. He opened the desk drawer, finding nothing but small pots of paint, used for brightening up antiques, and a paintbrush. He wondered if he would be able to throw paint in the man's face and blind him for long enough to escape. He opened the top of a pot of paint and dipped in his finger. "What are you doing?" asked a voice close to his ear. "Nothing," said Bod, screwing the top on the paint pot and dropping it into one of the jacket's enormous pockets. Liza Hempstock looked at him unimpressed. "Why are you in here?" she asked. "And whose old bag of lard out there?" "It's his shop. I was trying to sell him something." "Why?" "None of your beeswax." She sniffed. "Well," she said, "you should get 'em back to the graveyard." "I can't, he's locked me in." "Of course he can, just slip through the wall." He shook his head. "I can't. I can only do it at home because they gave me the freedom of the graveyard when I was a baby." He looked up at her under the electric light. It was hard to see her properly, but Bod had spent his life talking to dead people. "Anyway, what are you doing here? What are you doing out from the graveyard? It's daytime. And you're not like Silas, you're meant to stay in the graveyard." She said, "There's rules for those in the graveyards, but not for those as was buried in unhallowed ground. Nobody tells me what to do or where to go." She glared at the door. "I don't like that man," she said. "I'm going to see what he's doing." A flicker and Bod was alone in the room once more. He heard a rumble of distant thunder. In the cluttered darkness of Bolger's antiquities, Abanazar Bolger looked up suspiciously, certain that someone was watching him. Then realised he was being foolish. "The boy's locked in the room," he told himself. "The front door's locked." He was polishing the metal clasp surrounding the snake stone as gently and as carefully as an archaeologist on a dig, taking off the black and revealing the glittering silver beneath it. He was beginning to regret calling Tom Hustings over, although Hustings was big and good for scaring people. He was also beginning to regret that he was going to have to sell the brooch when he was done. It was special. The more it glittered under the tiny light on his counter, the more he wanted it to be his, and only his. There was more from where this came from, though. The boy would tell him. The boy would lead him to it. The boy. An idea struck him. He put down the brooch, reluctantly, and opened a drawer behind the counter, taking out a metal biscuit tin filled with envelopes and cards and slips of paper. He reached in and took out a card, only slightly larger than a business card. It was black-edged. There was no name or address printed on it, though. Only one word, handwritten in the centre in an ink that had faded to brown. Jack. On the back of the card, in pencil, Abanazar Bolger had written instructions to himself in his tiny, precise handwriting, as a reminder, although he would not have been likely to forget the use of the card. How to use it to summon the man Jack. No, not summon. Invite. You did not summon people like him. A knocking on the outer door of the shop. Bolger tossed the card down onto the counter and walked over to the door, peering out into the wet afternoon. "Hurry up," called Tom Hustings. "It's miserable out here, dismal. I'm getting soaked." Bolger unlocked the door and Tom Hustings pushed his way in, his raincoat and hair dripping. "What's so important you can't talk about it over the phone, then?" "Our fortune," said Abanazar Bolger with his sour face. "That's what." Hustings took off his raincoat and hung it on the back of the shop door. "What is it? Something good fell off the back of a lorry?" "Treasure," said Abanazar Bolger. "Two kinds." He took his friend over to the counter, showed him the brooch under the little light. "It's old, isn't it?" "From pagan times," said Abanazar. "Before. From Druid times. Before the Romans came. It's called a snake stone. Seen 'em in museums. I've never seen metalwork like that, or one so fine. Must have belonged to a king. The lad who found it says it come from a grave. Think of a barrow filled with stuff like this." "Might be worth doing it legit," said Hustings thoughtfully. "Declare it as treasure trove. They have to pay us market value for it, and we could make them name it after us. The Hustings Bolger bequest." "Bolger Hustings," said Abanazar automatically. Then he said, "There's a few people I know of, people with real money who would pay more than market value if they could hold it as you are." For Tom Hustings was fingering the brooch gently, like a man stroking a kitten, and there'd be no questions asked. He reached out his hand and reluctantly Tom Hustings passed him the brooch. You said 2 kinds of treasure, said Hustings. What's t'other? Ebenezer Bolger picked up the black-edged card, held it out for his friend's inspection. Do you know what this is? His friend shook his head. Ebenezer put the card down on the counter. There's a party is looking for another party. So? The way I heard it, said Ebenezer Bolger, the other party is a boy. There's boys everywhere, said Tom Hustings. Running all around, getting into trouble. Can't abide them. So, there's a party looking for a particular boy. This lad looks to be the right sort of age. He's dressed, well, you'll see how he's dressed. And he found this. It could be him. And if it is him? Ebenezer Bolger picked up the card again by the edge and waved it back and forth, slowly as if running the edge along an imaginary flame. Here comes a candle to light you to bed, he began. And here comes a chopper to chop off your head, concluded Tom Hustings thoughtfully. But look you, if you call the man Jack, we lose the boy. But if we lose the boy, we lose the treasure. And the 2 men went back and forth on it, weighing the merits and disadvantages of reporting the boy or of collecting the treasure, which had grown in their minds to a huge underground cavern filled with precious things. And as they debated, Ebenezer pulled a bottle of sloe gin from beneath the counter and poured them both a generous tot to assist the celebrations. Liza was soon bored with their discussion, which went back and forth and around like a whirligig, getting nowhere, so she went back into the storeroom to find Bod standing in the middle of the room with his eyes tightly closed and his fists clenched, and his face all screwed up as if he had a toothache, almost purple from holding his breath. What you were doing of now? She asked, unimpressed. He opened his eyes and relaxed. Trying to fade, he said. Liza sniffed. Try again, she said. He did, holding his breath even longer this time. Stop that, she told him, or you'll pop. Bod took a deep breath and then sighed. It doesn't work, he said. Maybe I could hit him with a rock and just run for it. There wasn't a rock, so he picked up a coloured glass paperweight, hefted it in his hand, wondering if he could throw it hard enough to stop Ebenezer Bolger in his tracks. There's 2 of them out there now, said Liza, and if the one don't get you, the other one will. They say they want to get you to show them where you got the brooch, and then dig up the grave and take the treasure. She did not tell him about the other discussions they were having, nor about the black-edged card. She shook her head. Why did you do something as stupid as this anyway? You know the rules about leaving the graveyard. Just asking for trouble it was. Bod felt very insignificant and very foolish. I wanted to get you a headstone, he admitted in a small voice, and I thought it would cost more money, so I was going to sell him the brooch to buy you one. She didn't say anything. Are you angry? She shook her head. It's the first nice thing anyone's done for me in 500 years, she said, with a hint of a goblin smile. Why would I be angry? Then she said, What do you do when you try to fade? What Mr. Pennyworth told me. I am an empty doorway. I am a vacant alley. I am nothing. Eyes will not see me. Glances slip over me. But it never works. It's because you're alive, said Liza with a sniff. There's stuff as works for us, the dead, who have to fight to be noticed at the best of times, that won't never work for you people. She hugged herself tightly, moving her body back and forth as if she were debating something. Then she said, It's because of me you got into this. Come here, Nobody Owens. He took a step towards her in that tiny room, and she put her cold hand on his forehead. It felt like a wet silk scarf against his skin. Now, she said, perhaps I can do a good turn for you. And with that she began to mutter to herself, mumbling words that Bod could not make out. Then she said, clear and loud, "Be old, be dust, be dream, be wind, be night, be dark, be wish, be mind. Now slip, now slide, now move unseen, above, beneath, betwixt, between." Something huge touched him, brushed him from head to feet, and he shivered. His hair prickled, and his skin was all goose flesh. Something had changed. "What did you do?" he asked. "Just gived you an helping hand," she said. "I may be dead, but I'm a dead witch, remember? And we don't forget." "But, hush up," she said. "They're coming back." The key rattled in the storeroom lock. "Now then, chummy," said a voice Bod had not heard clearly before. "I'm sure we're all going to be great friends." And with that, Tom Hustings pushed open the door. Then he stood in the doorway looking around, looking puzzled. He was a big, big man with foxy red hair and a bottle-red nose. "Here, Ebenezer, thought you said he was in here." "I did," said Bulger from behind him. "Well, I can't see I'd no hear of him." Bulger's face appeared behind the ruddy man's, and he peered into the room. "Hiding," he said, staring straight at where Bod was standing. "No use hiding," he announced loudly. "I can see you there. Come on out." The two men walked into the little room, and Bod stood stock still between them and thought of Mr. Pennyworth's lessons. He did not react. He did not move. He let the men's glances slide from him without seeing them. "You're going to wish you'd come out when I called," said Bulger, and he shut the door. "Right," he said to Tom Hustings. "You block the door so he can't get past." And with that he walked around the room, peering behind things and bending awkwardly to look beneath the desk. He walked straight past Bod and opened the cupboard. "Now I see you," he shouted. "Come out." Liza giggled. "What was that?" asked Tommy Hustings, spinning round. "I didn't hear nothing," said Ebenezer Bulger. Liza giggled again. Then she put her lips together and blew, making a noise that began as a whistling and then sounded like a distant wind. The electric lights in the little room flickered and buzzed, then they went out. "Bloody fuses," said Ebenezer Bulger. "Come on, this is a waste of time." The key clicked in the lock and Liza and Bod were left alone in the room. "He's gone away," said Ebenezer Bulger. Bod can hear him now through the door. "Room like that, there wasn't anywhere he could have been hiding. We'd have seen him if he was." "The man Jack won't like that." "Who's going to tell him?" Pause. "Here, Tom Hustings, where's the brooch gone?" "Huh? That? Here, I was keeping it safe." "Keeping it safe in your pocket? Funny place to be keeping it safe if you ask me. More like you were planning to make off with it. Like you was planning to keep my brooch for your own." "Your brooch, Ebenezer? Your brooch? Our brooch, you mean?" "As indeed I don't remember you being here when I got it from that boy." "That boy you couldn't even keep safe for the man Jack, you mean? Can you imagine what he'll do when he finds you had the boy he was looking for and you let him go?" "Probably not the same boy. Lots of boys in the world. What are the odds it was the one he was looking for? Out the back door as soon as my back was turned, I'll bet." And then Ebenezer Bulger said in a high, wheedling voice, "Don't worry about the man Jack, Tom Hustings. I'm sure it was a different boy. My old mind playing tricks, and we're almost out of sloe gin. How would you fancy a good scotch? I've whiskey in the back room. You just wait here a minute." The storeroom door was unlocked and Ebenezer entered holding a walking stick and an electric torch, looking even more sour of face than before. "If you're still in here," he said in a sour mutter, "don't even think of making a run for it. I've called the police on you. That's what I've done." A rummage in a drawer produced a half-filled bottle of whiskey and then a tiny black bottle. Abanazar poured several drops from the little bottle into the larger, then he pocketed the tiny bottle. "My brooch and mine alone," he muttered, and followed it with a barked, "Just coming, Tom." He glared around the dark room, staring past Bod. Then he left the storeroom, carrying the whisky in front of him. He locked the door behind him. "Here you go," came Abanazar Bulger's voice through the door. "Give us your glass then, Tom. Nice drop of scotch. Put ours on your chest. Say when." Silence. "Cheap muck. Aren't you drinking?" "That sloe gine's gone to my innards. Give it a minute for my stomach to settle." Then, "Here, Tom, what have you done with my brooch?" "Your brooch, is it now? Whoa! What did you put something in my drink, you little grub?" "What if I did? I could read on your face what you was planning, Thomasstins. Thief!" And then there was shouting and several crashes and loud bangs, as if heavy items of furniture were being overturned. Then silence. Liza said, "Quickly now, let's get you out of here." "But the door's locked." He looked at her. "Is there something you can do?" "Me? I don't have any magics will get you out of a locked room, boy." Bod crouched and peered out through the keyhole. It was blocked. The key sat in the keyhole. Bod thought. Then he smiled momentarily, and it lit his face like a flash of light bulb. He pulled a crumpled sheet of newspaper from a packing case, flattened it out as best he could, then pushed it underneath the door, leaving only a corner on his side of the doorway. "What are you playing at?" asked Liza impatiently. "I need something like a pencil, only thinner," he said. "Here we go." And he took a thin paintbrush from the top of the desk and pushed the brushless end into the lock, jiggled it and pushed some more. There was a muffled clunk as the key was pushed out, as it dropped from the lock onto the newspaper. Bod pulled the paper back under the door now with the key sitting on it. Liza laughed, delighted. "Ah, that's wit, young man," she said. "That's wisdom." Bod put the key in the lock, turned it and pushed open the storeroom door. There were the two men on the floor, in the middle of the crowded antique shop. Furniture had indeed fallen. The place was a chaos of wrecked clocks and chairs, and in the midst of it the bulk of Tom Hustings lay, fallen on the smaller figure of Abanazar Bulger. Neither of them was moving. "Are they dead?" asked Bod. "No such luck," said Liza. On the floor beside the men was a brooch of glittering silver, a crimson-orange banded stone, held in place with claws and with snake heads, and the expression on the snake heads was one of triumph and avarice and satisfaction. Bod dropped the brooch into his pocket, where it sat beside the heavy glass paperweight, the paintbrush, and the little pot of paint. "Take this too," said Liza. Bod looked at the black-edged card with the word Jack handwritten on one side. It disturbed him. There was something familiar about it, something that stirred old memories, something dangerous. "I don't want it." "You can't leave it here with them," said Liza. "They were going to use it to hurt you." "I don't want it," said Bod. "It's bad. Burn it." "No!" Liza gasped. "Don't do that. You mustn't do that." "Then I'll give it to Silas," said Bod, and he put the little card into an envelope, so he had to touch it as little as possible, and put the envelope into the inside pocket of his old gardening jacket, beside his heart. 200 miles away, the man Jack woke from his sleep and sniffed the air. He walked downstairs. "What is it?" asked his grandmother, stirring in the contents of a big iron pot on the stove. "What's got into you now?" "I don't know," he said. "Something's happening. Something interesting." And then he licked his lips. "Smells tasty," he said. "Very tasty." And that's the end of today's session of The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. So, I shall see you tomorrow to see what adventures Pod gets up to next. See you later. Sleep well. Bye.